Well, grace and peace, everyone. My name is Dag, and welcome to the Uninvited Voice podcast.
We know that when he came down that escalator, he said he was going to stop Muslim immigration into this country. And so it is not surprising that he is going after black immigrants in this country. And it's certainly not surprising that he's choosing a black immigrant community that is also Muslim. But what
Well, grace and peace, everyone. It is December the 5th at 11:15 a.m., and we have to talk about the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration against the Somalis in Minnesota. Apparently, there has been a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse going on up there. And I felt I'd chime in, being that I probably interacted with the first set of refugees that got here in the 90s. For many of you, you know that I traveled locum tenens as a sonographer. And for some reason, I think it's because I had a best friend and I also had a cousin living out there in Minneapolis. Every year, beginning in around 1998, I made it a point to go to Minneapolis and spend the winter there. Why? I don't know, because it is hella cold up there. And when I first started going up there, the one thing that I noticed was the Somalis. I was taken aback because it was the first time I had ever seen people who looked very similar to myself. Yes, you can tell the difference between a Somali and I, most definitely. But when I say similar to myself, I'm talking about the skull shape. And I had always been sort of kicked to the side by most of Black America because of my skull shape. Now, in all in all fairness, I do come from a mixed background, a multiracial background, but the base of that background comes from the Sahel. I have both Bambara and Fulani mixed in me from Senegal. In fact, it goes so far that not only do my genetics trace back there, but there are family names and everyone that pops up in ancestry.com and 23andMe when I was on it. So I've reconnected with some of those family members. That's how true to life my genetics are. And it's reflected in how I look. I'm tall, I'm narrow, I'm thin, I got a little skinny head, got a little bit of buck to the teeth. Um, and when I first went out to Somali, I remember feeling so embraced when you had these tall people who were similar to me calling me sister. And it was just a warm embrace. It was the first time I'd ever really been embraced by other Black people. It never happened before. So I'll be the first one to say that, I was really in their corner when they first came here. And I went out there every year and interacted with a lot of people in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I mostly hung around with my friends, my best friend, who was a model who lived there. But for the most part, I was there and I saw their evolution. And one of the things that I thought was unfair at the time was how my best friend, who happens to be a Black American, he's dark skinned, gay, very Sahelian looking. He looks like his family lineage connects with Mississippi and Louisiana. So more than likely, he probably is coming out of Senegal and Mali somewhere as well. But one of the things that I felt was a little unfair on his part was how he always criticized the Somalis. He said they were rude. He really did not like them. He was just having a hard time interacting with the Somalis, and he lived there. As for me, it was a little bit different. I don't know if it was because of the similarities structurally and the complexion, because a lot of them did at the time think that I was Ethiopian. They didn't think I was Somali, but they thought I was Ethiopian. And we just had a different interaction with them. Nonetheless, I followed their journey. Even though I stopped going there, I think in 2000 was my last assignment, and I ended up coming out to New England and remaining. But I followed them on the internet. I would always check up to see what was going on and see how they were doing. And, I found out that later on, after I had moved to Italy and I became engulfed in social media, because that was all I could pretty much do. I really didn't speak the language that well when I first moved there. And I was always on social media, Facebook. At the time, they had MySpace and YouTube, and I was heavily into blogging at the time. So I followed them, and I found myself in a lot of Afrocentric spaces, American spaces, Black American spaces, and listening in and looking at the interactions they were having with Black Americans. By the time there was a return to Africa in 2021, 2000, between 2018 and 2021, there were a lot of people moving back to the continent of Africa, particularly West Africa, the Gambia, and places such as Tanzania. And this is where I started noticing more things. Now, mind you, in between that time when I was in Italy, I noticed that there were a lot of Somalis on websites like, what is that place called? Not 4chan. It was one of those white supremacist websites. And there were a lot of them. Wherever there was a white supremacist website, there were a lot of Somalis. And I found it odd. I'm like, well, what the hell happened? Was it because I know at one time there were a lot of clashes in the schools in Minnesota in which the Black American kids and the Somali kids were actively fighting and going after each other. And initially I thought, well, maybe it's because they're having the same type of issue with bullying that I had. I was very quick to mirror my own experience onto them because when I was growing up, being skinny, being tall, looking different, being somewhat neurodivergent and undiagnosed, I really had a hard time growing up. I grew up in Hempstead, New York. And I really had a hard time growing up there because I was always bullied because I didn't look like the other kids. And, not only was it a case of not looking like them, but it was also the fact that there was a lot of classism. So that played a part as well. So I mirrored my experience and thought, well, maybe the Somalis are just fighting back based on being bullied or something. It really didn't, the inner dynamics of how they felt really didn't occur until I started seeing them on websites like Stormfront and 4chan. So even then, I was quick to say, maybe they're aligning themselves with white people who hate Black Americans because of their experience with Black Americans. I was still wanting to see myself and my own experience and impinging it onto their existence. But the one thing that bothered me, being someone of West African descent, was how they perceived West Africans. So once I started seeing how they saw not only West Africans, everybody, every other African outside of Ethiopians and Somalis, they viewed as Bantu. That's what they did. They broad stroked everyone as Bantu. Everyone was shorter than they were. Everyone had a big nose. Everyone had four hair. Everyone had broad faces. Everyone was ugly, and they were the be all end all. They didn't know anything about the various populations or the fact that no one in West Africa speaks a Bantu language. they knew nothing about West Africa at all, or the fact that if they go over to Senegal, they will more than likely be the short ones in the mix. If they go to Mali, they would be short. So there was just this lack of knowing on their part that struck me as odd. And so not only did I see, because I used to lurk, I lurk. It doesn't matter where it is. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be looking. I may not say anything, but I definitely look and I listen. And I noticed how they would speak about themselves and try to carve out a space within this white supremacist ideology. They felt they were the true Aryans. They thought that white people came from them because they are L3 and they are East Africans, and the out out of Africa theory starts in East Africa. So they felt that white people come from them and they are the closest to them, and therefore they align with them. Once we started noticing, and I'm going to say myself, I started noticing because right around when the pandemic hit, there was nothing for any of us to do. We were all stranded inside for at least 2 years, right? So we were always online. Everyone was online. And out of my curiosity and based on the fact that I had lived in Italy for 6 years, I started following people who had moved to Africa. I followed, let's see, who there were a lot of different people who had gone to West Africa at the time. Bag Family was one of them. And in following Bag Family, there were other people that also had channels, and I started following them. So I said, okay, let me see what's going on. And a lot of times they would have these live chat sessions. And then when issues arose and broke out, you had a little gossip here and there. It was interesting as heck. And you know what? To be very honest, to any of those people that are out there, that are still out there, I would say capitalize it. Monetize that baggage, monetize the gossip, let the clicks come, and don't worry about it. Just let it go. Because people are making a lot of money on that, but that's neither here nor there. What I noticed was that when the gossip started hitting and the Africans, the continental Africans, started having their live sessions, I would go and I would listen in. And of course, you had the Black Americans who would also go, and everybody was listening. And people just felt free to say what they wanted to in these spaces. And there was one guy in particular, I think he was an East African who had a site, and he had that same mentality, although he wasn't Somali. I forgot his name. But a lot of the Somalis started coming out of the closet during these live sessions and making a lot of broad, sweeping generalizations. They did not like Black Americans. They felt we were lazy. They talked about the men not liking their women, which is true. In all fairness, it's true. The men do not like Black women. Um, they would talk about Black women like dogs. They would say that we were all ratchet. We were all this. We were all fat. We were all welfare recipients. We were this, that, and the other. They would talk about um, us not having a culture. They would talk about how we didn't know where we were from and that we were Bantus. They were quick to call us Bantus and Jarir. And it was like a powwow for them. And I'm sure it was an eye opener for those of us who were raised to acknowledge a connection to Africa. Now, let me give you some backstory. I have an actual African name. First name, middle name. So that's another thing that caused me a lot of problems growing up in Hempstead, New York. In addition to that, one of the things they would do was go get the National Geographic pick out the because at the time the Ethiopians were starving, and there were so many kids in that book that would sometimes look like me, and they would get the book and they would say, "Oh, look, this is Day," and I'm like, But anyway, regardless of that, I knew where that name came from. I knew why my parents selected it. They were these power to the people, members of SNCC and other things that they were doing back in the 70s and whatnot, and trying to be Afrocentric. And not only that, my grandmother, who I was raised with after my parents divorced, would always tell me about the one great grandmother that I had that was a slave. And she told me that she had come to America at the age of 12 on a ship, and that her hair was so matted that they had to cut it off. And she was very tall, she was very thin, and I stuck with that. So I always knew that connection. Now, there was also a certain tendency towards saying that we were Indians as well, right? And what I found out later on was that no, we were not Cherokee, and it wasn't a Cherokee princess grandmother, it was the male. And there was a picture. It was a very handsome, light-skinned man with curly, wavy hair, narrow eyes, really good-looking man, right? And what I found out was that they weren't Indians. They were actually multiracial, multi-generational slave traders and slave traffickers. My family is the Holman family, and the Holman family interacted with the Lopins and the other multiracial slave traders and slave holders down in Barnwell, South Carolina. There was a lot of that. There was a lot of that. So I assume that this is one reason why they sort of revised themselves into Native Americans. But at the same time, my great grandmother, who actually came over on the same ship with the Holman family, she later intermarried with that family. She later intermarried with them, and thus you have this big conglomeration of people. So we knew our grandmother was a slave. We knew that direct descendant, and that was the only one they talked about. Everybody else they said was Indian, and we know what that means now. Slave traders. At any rate, when I got to be older, I went to the National Archives when I was stationed in Fort Belvoir, and I went to search the records because I wanted to know if I could find my grandmother. Didn't have a name for her, didn't have anything, right? It wasn't until a couple of years ago where, you have the archives online with Ancestry, and I was able to pay, of course. I think it should be free, but I was able to pay and go all the way back until I found a woman named Asia in the 1870 census. And I'm like, Asia? What kind of name is that? Wow. And then when you look far down into the roster as to where her parents were born, it said clear as day, Africa. So I'm like, Africa? Wow. One was African and one was African. And then there was another shipping record that linked to the man she married, his parents, who came over from they were Malagasy. They came over from Madagascar over on a ship, initially landed in Louisiana, and then went up to South Carolina. They lived on a rice plantation. And I know I'm getting far out. I hope I'm not boring you. But at any rate, I went ahead and I found out. I took the African ancestry test, and it led to Senegal. And I'm like, wow, but mitochondrial DNA does not change, right? What really confirmed it for me was when a woman who is also from a blended background, she was living over in Guinea. Her last name, the family names in her family are Khan and Karoma. So this woman is blended Mandinka and Fulani, right? She's on my Fulani side. In addition to that, there's a man on YouTube who did his ancestry results. He also came up in my queue, and he's Fulani, and he's one of my cousins. So that all confirmed it for me, right? So I know where my people are from. That's not something I'm going to deny. I was a bit taken aback with the Holman lineage, but you know what? It is what it is. That's what they were doing. You know, Holman intermarried with a slave trading tribe on the continent. And he intermarried and he took all of his family and came down. So I descend from the females of that family. Anyway, going back, what I found in going to these websites when we were doing all these live chats and stuff was I found a lot of Black Americans who had always been sort of programmed to see Africa as a link, an essential link, and identifying as African American. Now, that's one thing I did not do. I did not identify as Black, as African American. Never. I would always check other. I would always check other. I would always, if you pushed it, I would say Black during my earlier years. But other than that, I did not identify as African American, regardless of who my great grandmother was, because I had all of those other lineages. And that's not even counting my father's background. Um, but what I found was that while we were on these live chats and hearing these Somalis calling people Jarir and Bantus and saying all kinds of horrible things. And this was in the company of other Africans, Nigerians, people from Ghana, people from Kenya. All of them were getting in and dogpiling on Black Americans in some of these chat rooms. And then you had the Black Americans who started pushing back. Now, ADOS was always a thing, had started, but then from there, it flipped into FBA, Foundation of Black Americans, which, although I'm not really that fond of the leadership, or the person who founded FBA, because I think he monetizes a little too much, I am grateful that he does push back on some of the things, and he is hella funny. And he's also very talented because he is definitely a singer. I wish he would do more of that than some of the stuff he does online. But Tariq Nasheed, all right, he started the whole foundational thing. And, regardless of what he does on the internet, Foundational Black American is a little bit more inclusive than ADOS, because when you start looking into your family background and you see one enslaved person, and then you start seeing the rest as either slave traffickers or, slave owners down in the South, it's kind of bittersweet. You don't know if you can claim to be ADOS. You don't know. So foundational Black American is a lot better, you know? But in seeing all of these people and the things that they were saying, and then seeing the things that they would say on Stormfront, when you read some of the things that some of these Somalis were saying about how their skull shape was so different and it was closer to Caucasian and they were Caucasians. And eventually, when I started looking at like into schools, I was going to go back to grad school. And when I started looking at some of the schools and looking at some of the forms, you'll find that on those forms, the Somalis don't fall under sub-Saharan African Black. They have their own category. So they've managed to carve out a space and call themselves Caucasians. They consider themselves Caucasian. So with all of that said, now that the rhetoric from the Trump administration is coming out, and Trump is just very honest in his opinions. He was very angered by all of the fraud, waste, and abuse that's going on up there. People pretending to have autistic children and utilizing it as a money grab, you know? So I can understand his frustration, but also I can also understand it from the point of seeing how they've been interacting. Now I look back at, my friend in Minneapolis, and I'm looking at him and thinking he had a different experience, more than likely because of his complexion. You know, this is a new and improved type of racism that they've brought in. And they're not the only ones, because a lot of those people on those live chats were also from the Caribbean. You had a lot of people from Haiti, especially them, and some of them were the most vocal against Black Americans. And I sat there and I would sit there and I would listen. Sometimes I would interject and correct on history because they have oh my God. One, they think everybody's a Nigerian because of the skewed results of some of these genetic testing. And you got to be a total idiot to think that if you take 4,000 samples of Nigerians and put them in a total of 5,000 samples, 4,000 out of 5,000 samples, and test people, more than likely, most of those results are going to reflect what you call Nigerian. Because you've taken all the damn samples from there. But that they believe these results wholeheartedly because they're not really aware of of stats and what's actually going into these genetic tests. So one, they started calling everybody Nigerian. They started broad stroking everybody into a certain look. Everybody who didn't look like that, they accused them of being from another country or being mixed race or something like that. And they were just very vile and vicious. So this started this whole movement of Black Americans delineating and acknowledging who they actually were, which is multi generational mulattoes. I don't care if you have 46%, I don't care if you have 20, 30, 10. You're a multi generational mulatto. You know, calling yourself Black, that is a caste. That is what we've created over here, you know. But when you actually start interacting with Black people from the continent who are not seeing you the same way, then the reality hits. They're not acknowledging you. They only see you as a caste. So when they come over here, they start talking down to you. They start making all kinds of vile references. They create their own epithets. People getting called a kata, which means a wild cat. In other words, an alley cat. So you are not a Siamese. You are not a Burmese. You are an alley cat, while we are Siamese and we are this. This is what they're saying to you. So, yes, it is indeed a slur. Jarir, um, Bantu, and the N word with the hard R. I used to hear that, and the only time you heard it said, it came from the Somalis. The Somalis were using the R at the end of the N word because they did not feel a kindred spirit. They did not feel as if they were the same. So now the shit has hit the fan. And earlier, I played for you a video in which Ilhan Omar was talking about how the Trump administration was bigoted and how he, brought up the whole countries commentary from his first term. And you know what? Here's the deal. They tried to get West Africans involved in that. Those shithole countries that he was talking about were indeed from East Africa. He wasn't talking about West Africans. And I found it ironic that people would try and drag Nigeria into it because they immediately went over to the Nigerian president and said, "How do you feel about Trump's comments about shithole countries?" Nigerians are smart. The Nigerians probably listened in and said, "Well, he's not talking about us." So they didn't really have any kind of reflection on it. You know, he was actually talking about those countries from Somalia. Fast forward, now you have all of this money, billions bilked out of the taxpayers to the point where he wants them all out. He removed their temporary protective status and wants to deport Omar because she is one of those this oh, I represent Somalia first. Somalia first. No the hell you don't. You're in our government. And her whole point of being in our government is to influence things on behalf of Somalia. That's not how it goes. When you're in this country, in our government, you influence things based on the citizens of your district and in your state. It has nothing to do with your funky ass country. So now that the shit has hit the fan, you hear all of these people now talking about how Trump is targeting black immigrants, and it's no surprise that he's targeting the Somali community. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You guys said you weren't black. Your skulls aren't like everybody else. You're not Bantus. You're not Jariers. Why the hell are you black now? You know, like I said, had this evolved many years ago when I first interacted with them, when they were sweet and nice and happy to be here and embracing people, I probably would feel different. But in light of all of the things that I've heard on the internet, I can't help but say that it's best that the Trump administration gets these people out now. Get them out. Get all of these people who have all of these anti black, racist type of ideals, although they claim to be people of color. Get all of these racist ass people of color out of here because all they've done was interrupt and set us back in the civil rights that we worked for in the 60s and the 70s. This is not what anyone meant when they wanted civil rights and integration. And in many ways I think it was also it was like a sleight of hand because you passed the Civil Rights Act in 64 and then you turned around and removed the quotas of 1924 in the 1965 Immigration Act. So you let all of these daggone people in, all of these immigrants in, and then bequeath all of the benefits that were bestowed under affirmative action to them so that the black Americans never moved. And then you allow Nicaragua to use black America to fund their war by distributing crack in the communities. Yes, and black young black men assisted them. So I find all of this ironic. All of that stuff has set black America back. But even more so, what's gone on in the workplace, my aunts used to tell me about this a long time ago. They were nurses in New York, that they would be working on jobs, and then the West Indians, that's what they would call them, the West Indians would get in, and they would hire their own, and they would lock black Americans out. It's no different than today. Nowadays, when you're going in technical positions and in the hospitals and whatnot, the Nigerians, the Kenyans, they'll ally against you. They'll lock you out because you're a foreigner. Not because you're a foreigner, because they're foreigners and because you're a black American. They'll lock black Americans out, and they have been doing it. And the same goes for all of these Indian Brahmins and stuff. They have issues with their own darker skinned people, but they also lock black Americans out of jobs. Try to make you look incompetent. Try to, pull the wool from underneath you. They've been doing this a lot. They all get in, all of these little cluster communities get in and they group together and then they hire their own and then they have this cross intra-community thing in which they will hire other immigrants or they'll rent to other immigrants, but they don't rent to other black Americans. This is not good for our society. This is not good for this country. I think they all need to leave. Now, some of them have been born here, and some of them are going to hang on to their culture because right around the 80s, we had these nutcases, preaching to us in black communities about keeping your flavor. maintaining your flavor. This is no longer a melting pot. This is um, a salad bowl where everyone maintains their flavor. I heard that in high school all the way through college in the 90s. And initially, I was brainwashed into thinking, oh, yeah, this is a great thing. They brainwashed you into thinking that people of color was some kind of ally and that you were no different from the Latino person or the African person or whatever. And ideally, it, if everyone thought that way, it would have been fine, I guess. But the reality was much more stark. The reality was, although you might see someone who might be similar in color to you or even darker than you, but they speak a different language, they're looking down on you. They don't feel that you're the same. They don't feel any kind of alliance with you. They'll ally against you because they hate you, because they brought all of their tribal and ethnic diatribe into this country with them. And now they've included you because a lot of times, and this is another thing that happened with the Somali community, and I know for a fact because having a strange foreign name and looking different and being that peanut butter color, white people in the Midwest or in some other places may not see you as they see the local Black Americans. When the Somalis started coming in, white people were quick to start saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful, and you're so much better than Black Americans, and they're such great people, and they're so nice, and whatever else." Almost immediately in 1998, they were all working in the airport, in the airlines. How the hell are they working in the airports? They just got here. They were working in jobs; those were good jobs. Suddenly, you didn't see any Black Americans working there. You didn't see any Black Americans behind the counter. You didn't see any of them. They put the Somalis out front. They put them in, in baggage claim. They put them all of it in Columbus, Ohio, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then from there, they started spanning into other places. They were hiring them and definitely not hiring Black Americans. And in some ways, I will say for good reason, because there is a certain element of Black Americans that you don't want working for you because they are evil as hell and they are rude and everything else. So I understand, I get it, but that's not everybody. They were just throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I can understand not hiring Bonquisha, but you got Lisa and you got Janine, and they're good workers and they're nice people, but you just don't like the way they look or you don't like the way they sound, despite they might be nice. They might be very adept at what they're doing. They might go above and beyond and be 10 times better than everyone else, but because they're Black Americans, you are blinded and you say, I don't want them working for me. Give me a Somali. This is what happened. So you can't blame everybody for saying, you're saying that Black Americans aren't this and they're lazy and this, that, and the other. They're being pushed out of their communities, pushed out of housing, pushed out of employment, and blocked out of the schools. All of those Black people that are up there, these so-called Black people that you see in Harvard and Brown and all these, those aren't Black Americans. Those are Caribbeans and Africans, mostly Nigerians. The same people that come out and call you a kata. So it didn't really surprise me in seeing all of these different people moving out to Africa, to the Gambia and stuff. And I really wished it would have gone well. But after seeing what happened when they went over there was also an awakening because a lot of them were not seen as fellow Africans. They were seen as Americans. They were seen as mulattoes. They were seen as white people. Too bad. A lot of them were getting knocked over the head. Some of the women were getting killed and murdered after, befriending some of these men over there. They take up with these men, and next thing you know, the men knock them over the head, kill them, and take all of their possessions, their cars, throwing them in wells. This is the stuff that was going on in Africa. So you got a whole population of people that not only witnessed it, but experienced it and came back to the United States and also now are pushing back against all of this bias since they've seen it not only over here, They've seen it over there, and they're seeing it even more so online. So I do not feel any sympathy or compassion with the Somalis. I really don't. And for those of you who are listening in and you're in other African countries and you're thinking Trump is a racist and Trump is this, no, you got to be here. You have got to be here and experience it for yourself. No, I have not had any. The only, in fact, in some of these chat rooms, the only people that actually understood what was going on, the dynamics, were the people from South Africa because they understand. The South African colored community understand. They got it. Some of the other people did not. You got to be here. When people come into your home and treat you like shit and look down their nose at you, you're going to feel some kind of way about it. This is not just xenophobia. And when it starts reaching to the point, now this has been going on in Black America for a long time, since the 80s, the 90s, when it really started, when you started seeing this influx of different people. And nobody said anything. Nobody pushed back. That they've been run out of their communities and having to move back south because their places are overrun. They got kicked out. They didn't want to live around all these people that didn't like them. At any rate, that is what I have to say about what's going on with the Somali community. Please leave your comments in the box. And once again, my comments aren't meant to be offensive, but this is my opinion. These are my observations. Ciao, ciao, and have a great day.